Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Ruud, celui est mon collègue Michiel. Nous sommes de l'Université d'Anvers. Notre français n'est pas impeccable, donc we'll speak in English. We'll give this presentation in English for better or for worse. So, we're researchers from the University of Antwerp, the Department of Political Science, a research unit named Media, Movements and Politics. And one of the research questions that interests us most deals with protest participation. Who participates? Why do people participate in protest? How are people mobilized? And in order to answer these, in our opinion, fascinating questions, we've developed a new method in our research group. It's called protest surveying. And in fact, what we do to answer these questions of who participates, why do they do so, how are they mobilized, we go on the spot to demonstrations and we try to draw a random sample of this crowd so that we can have a representative sample and come up with accurate statistics, descriptives of these protesters. So, and the reason that we're here is because in the course of last year, we've done so. So we've surveyed several of these marches of the climate protest wave of last year. So our goals for tonight are basically twofold. First, we'll try to refresh your memory, so we'll give a brief presentation, a brief overview of the timeline of the Belgian climate protest wave, and our main goal here is to make very clear that it was really a unique moment in the history of Belgian climate protest. And our second goal is that we'll provide you hard evidence on some empirical questions related to the composition of these demonstrations. So who participated? Was it really the case that many more women participated in these marches? Was it true that it were all kinds of, that it was really a representative sample of Belgians that participated? Or was the sample, these participants in the street, was it biased towards the more highly educated, for instance? And we'll not only speak about the Belgian climate wave, but Michiel, he has also some data collected on Fridays for Future actions in many other European countries. So we'll compare the Belgian data with international data. But first things first, we'll give you a refresher, a timeline of what happened in Belgium last year. And I think it started on the 2nd of December with the Claim the Climate demonstration. This is a demonstration really at the beginning of the Conference of the Parties, the UN Climate Summit. And it's really a tradition in Belgium that the climate movement, that it mobilizes in Brussels beginning of December when the Conference of the Parties starts this UN Climate Summit. But this time it was exceptional. And it was exceptional for two reasons, I believe. First, because the turnout was exceptionally high. 65,000 people participated. That was, by then, it was a record. So it ended up in the Guinness Book of Belgian Climate Protest Records. And so what was also significant is that it was a very simple, clear claim that was communicated by this demonstration. It was simply, politicians, please show ambition. Be a front runner when it comes to taking climate policies at the European level. And so many media editorials were really supportive. They said this is really a momentum. The Belgian climate ministers should show ambition in Katowice, in Poland. And only 2 days after this march, the unthinkable happened, and Belgium was one of the 4 countries that didn't sign the European Energy Efficiency Directive. So this led really to outrageous reactions, also in the press, because of this ignorance of what this mobilized form of public opinion declared that politicians should do. Now, in Poland, there was also a young Swedish schoolgirl that gave a very inspiring speech, at least according to two Antwerp girls, Anuna de Wever and Kira Gantois, and they started a Facebook page in the end of December, and they made all Thursdays till elections pledge. So they started from January 10th. They started demonstrating in Brussels. So January 10th, 3,000 school pupils demonstrated in Brussels. A week later, 12,500 students demonstrated, and on January 24th, 35,000 youngsters participated. This was really unseen. It was exceptional. It was, I will use a French word, du jamais vu. So now, what was remarkable about this mobilization? It was the fact that it were youngsters. So they were politically voiceless. They didn't have the right to vote, but still, this issue, it really focuses on their future. I mean, the climate is important for all of us, but probably less for the elderly, the older generation. What was also important is that these demonstrations, they had an edge. There was this element of civil disobedience in it because they were not going to school. They were strikers. Thirdly, it was social media based, so there basically was not really a strong organizational backbone. It was not collective action, it was connective action. That's how they call it in the literature. And what's also remarkable is the increasing turnout, really having the momentum, feeling that something is going on, that it seems that if public opinion really was backing up these youngsters. Now, on January 27th, a Sunday, not only students, but also adults demonstrate and set a record-breaking turnout, 75,000 people in Brussels on a soaking wet Sunday with packed trains. So the organizers for Rise for Climate, they had to change the starting point of the march. They had to change the starting hour of the demonstration, all because of this unexpected success. So something was really happening here. For instance, that's a tweet by a Green parliamentarian, member of parliament, Christophe Calvo. He said, I was waiting on a train in Mechelen, and I had to wait for 3 trains because they were so packed I couldn't enter them. So it was really amazing. Really a groundbreaking moment, I believe, in Belgian climate mobilization. Then a second phase of the Youth for Climate movement started between January 31st and March 7th. They played a clever game. Instead of trying to break this record turnout, they said, let's employ a tactic of diffusion. So instead of mobilizing and demonstrating only in Brussels, they demonstrated in smaller local cities, for instance in Liège, but also in small communities like the district of Antwerp where I live, Deurne. What was also remarkable is that they got backup of one of the big figures of this new climate movement, Greta Thunberg, who came to Brussels to speak to Juncker, but also to attend this demonstration. And also politicians really start paying attention. So Juncker paid attention. They were invited by Macron, also Anuna and Kira and Adelaide. And some politicians also paid a price. For instance, the Flemish climate minister, Joke Schouwvliegen, she had to resign because how she commented on these youth demonstrators. After the second phase, or the end of the second phase, is marked by March 15th, which was a first day of international action organized by Fridays for Future, the global strike for future. These numbers, I retrieved them from internet. Probably they are not as accurate as we would want them to be, but in 125 countries, in more than 2,000 localities, 1.6 million people demonstrated and asked for more climate ambition. This is, again, unseen. And then, because I think Professor Zakai really nicely introduced it, the movement had to survive because of the All Thursdays Till election pledge till the 26th of May, the day of the mother of elections, because there were many elections going on. And you see that this was a moment of hesitation in the movement, we believe. So the movement was cooling down, the momentum was cooling down, less turnout, demonstration fatigue. But there was also, again, some tactical innovation going on. So there was this more radical movement tactic of occupying the Rue de la Loi, something that's normally not allowed, while ministers or members of parliament were debating a possible change in our constitution. And then on the 24th of May, 2 days before the election, there was this final call to vote wisely and with the issue of climate change in your mind on the 26th. So if you look at this from a calendar perspective, this was really a unique moment in Belgian climate mobilization history. So it started on the 2nd of December, the 26th of May is the red circle, and in between there was an amazing amount of climate mobilization going on. Now, how do you study this? How do you collect data about this? There's a famous American social movement scholar, and he says trying to study in protest or trying to study social movements is like trying to shoot, aiming at a moving target. So it's constantly evolving. So what we did is we took 2 snapshots of this mobilizing momentum. We gathered data in that period, that's now indicated in orange, by means of a Facebook survey. So we made a survey, we posted it, or one of the leaders of Youth for Climate, Kira Gantois, posted it on the Youth for Climate Facebook page, and about 800 people started the survey. So these are, we could say we surveyed sympathizers of Youth for Climate. And our crucial question was, who of these sympathizers ended up at one of these demonstrations in Brussels? So we tried to explain, or our goal was to explain who participates and who doesn't. And then a second snapshot of this movement was on when we went to Brussels itself and surveyed, using our protest survey method, the people present in the streets. It was on the 15th of March, the first global climate strike. And in the remainder of this presentation, I will talk about our findings. So our first crucial question is, was this a movement of girl power? So a lot of the leading figures were young girls, and traditionally we know that there's a gender gap on the street. So women tend to participate far less in protest compared to men. How was this in this early phase? Because I will talk about the early phase, the first snapshot. How was this? What do our data show? So 65% of our respondents were women. And when you look at how girls and boys participated, because most of them were youngsters, they participated equally. So normally there's a real gap on the streets, and boys tend to participate more. Here, this traditional participation gap in terms of gender was closed. So my answer to the question of girl power would be yes, it seemed to be that it was more equal gender representation on the streets. Maybe this is a sign of a new generation, I don't know. Maybe this has to do with the issue, but my answer would be yes, this was a movement of girl power with the leading figures and the presence of girls in the street. The second question we asked, are these students that are protesting, are they representative of all students? Because a lot of mass media coverage said this could be all students. This could be students of the general secondary education, but also of art education, and so on. Normally, what we know is that there's an education gap on the street. So the lower educated participate far less in protest compared to the higher educated. What did our data show? Well, almost half of all participants in our survey were attending general secondary education. So, and when we looked at participation, then 73% of all general secondary respondents participated, and only 21% of non-general secondary students attended. So basically what we find is that there's still a very persistent education gap on the streets and mobilization was driven by high school students. So no, not all students participated. Now, another question we asked, can attitudes explain, so your opinion about climate change, can this explain whether you participate or not? So do participants have more extreme issue positions compared to non-participants? Again, we asked the opinion of participants and non-participants on several issues related to climate change, and most of the time, how you think about the climate couldn't explain whether you participated in the protest marches or whether you didn't participate. Of course, all these Youth for Climate followers on Facebook are sympathizers. So there's this gap between participation and non-participation isn't overcome by being a more stringent believer in some of these climate issues. What did explain are the difference, and I'm skipping some slides because I'm taking too much time, is what did explain, or what was the biggest factor in explaining whether these youngsters participated or not, and that's why I asked whether they were teenage rebels or not, that is whether their parents supported them. So they were really described in the mass media as these teenage rebels, these disobedient teens that were protesting for the climate because their parents didn't. But our data basically shows that the most important factor distinguishing between youngsters that did participate in these protest marches and didn't participate was whether their parents supported them. So this is basically what I wanted to say about the early stage of mobilization. Michiel now will talk about the second stage.
So, as most of you already know, there have been 4 global climate strikes by now. The question I will address is whether the Belgian protesters differ from the international case, whether they differ from those in other countries. We have 4 global climate strikes by now, and we have collected data on actually 2 points in time, one in March and one in September. I will show data from both of these points. If we look at the FFF, the Fridays for Future protesters, on a global scale, or at least at the average level, so if we look at all the countries, we see some basic findings, and we see that FFF is mobilizing protesters who are exceptionally young, of which many are female, who are highly educated, who have supportive family backgrounds, as Ruud told you, of which many protest for the very first time, and who demand government to act on science. Now, these are basic points which probably don't surprise you, but I will now hopefully tell you or show you that the Belgian case is an outlier for several of these points. Let's first look at the age. We have a look at median age, so median is resistant for outliers, so this data is very reliable. And we see that the protesters in Brussels are relatively old. More than half of the protesters who were present in March are 40 years or older. For your information, we also had some data on climate protests, so the same issue, climate protest in 2009 in Belgium, Denmark, and the UK. And we also found median ages between 32 and 48. So it looks like the Belgian age composition is quite traditional here. If we look in more detail, so these figures, they show March and September. The green bars, they show the data for Belgium, and the see-through bars with the black outlines, that's the full data set, Belgium included. So you can see how Belgium compares to the full data set. It's noticeable that we have many more older people, with all respect, people older than 56. We also have a larger group of people aged between 26 and 55. And our share of youth is relatively small compared to the global data set, because in March, when we look at the 9 countries who are in our first data set, globally we have a share of 60%, but in Belgium only 33% make our protest population. And yeah, the same relation applies to September. So most of you will probably have heard of the OK Boomer meme, or the OK Boomer, the generational conflict. And I was just thinking about this meme because actually in Belgium we can't blame the boomer generation to be absent from the climate protests because they are clearly present. They even outgroup the youngsters. So we can't make the OK Boomer. Then if we look at gender, if you look at all the countries, we see a strong presence of female protesters. About 58% is female. Well, in Belgium, we actually find the reverse, be it more balanced. We have 46% of females, both in March and September. Education, climate protests in particular they tend to be the domain of the well-educated, and here Belgium is not an outlier because it fits the general pattern. For example, 71% of the high school students, and with high school students I mean people enrolled in secondary education below the age of 20, well, 70% has a parent with a university degree. Students themselves, they mostly study general secondary, so that's education preparing for university. The adults, they are mostly enrolled in university levels. Now, the family background. We asked our Belgian protesters how they perceive their climate crisis awareness of their parents. And well, they told us that they think their parents care about the climate. 71% agrees with the statement. They also think their parents, or they would also say that their parents undertake political action to prevent climate change, 57%. 56% agrees with the statement that their parents are making lifestyle changes. And they quite or very often discuss climate change with their parents. So these numbers only apply to the actual participants. We don't really find Belgium to be an outlier here, but we do find the predictable generational differences. So here you see the adults versus the school students. Brussels is not really an outlier but we do find that school students, 57% would say that my parents undertake political action, and whereas the adults only about 20% says so. Well, we also found that many protesters never participated before, so we have lots of first-timers. Dana Fischer, she called this the biographical consequence or the broader importance of the movement, because these youngsters, they learn how to protest and they will hopefully become more active protesters in the future. But correlated to the age composition in Brussels, we find that about 23% of the school students had never participated before. Then finally, I want to point your attention to the rhetoric of FFF. The basic claim of Fridays for Future is that the government should act on science and that something should change. And a scholar has criticized this rhetoric because it is presenting science as a solution to all, which potentially could depoliticize the whole issue. But I would say that maybe their rhetorics are indeed very simplified and very they are scientizing the issue, but behind the rhetorics we see a rather more a nuanced embrace of science, because actually when we ask them whether they agree with the statement that we can rely on science, in Belgium still 23% would say we can't rely on science. Of course, this has to be nuanced because these people probably mean science by and in itself can't solve the issue. Politicians have to use science, and then still ethical questions have to be made, or difficult political questions. So I thought that was interesting. these are the comparisons. So the global percentage of respondents who say that we can rely on government is 9%. Belgium is 8%. Well, about 11% would say we can rely on companies. Same for Belgium, same for science. And then we have a conclusion.
All right, really quickly. So Belgium was really an exceptional case, I believe. We were an early adapter, and we had many protests. But if you look at it, we had female leadership and a closed gender gap in the streets. So this is really something unique, we believe. Age, we had younger protesters in the beginning, but then the older took over. There was a persistent education gap. And finally, if we look at the voting behavior, and perhaps that's something that other speakers will speak about today, is about 80% of these demonstrators, they were intending to vote for the Green Party, Ecolo, or Groen. So was everyone really demonstrating like the mass media said, and were they united? Our data shows that wasn't really the case.